All right, everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Neil Winterig with Matterhorn Business Development, and today I am joined by Ashley May Guernaccini. She is an attorney, and I guess it would be proper to say you're the owner of At Cause Law, correct? Okay, yeah. I'd make sure I get all the legal words correct. We are going to take just a second here while the notifications still go out that we are live. But Ashley is an attorney, deals a lot with small business and business owners. And that's why we asked her to come in and talk today about some of the basic things and basic, omissions that business owners have when it comes to hiring, firing, all the legalities that we need to have in place to protect ourselves. So, Ashley, welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since you and I did a video.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
So why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself to everybody, and then we'll get straight into the topics.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Ashley Guernaccini, and I am the owner or managing partner of At Cause Law Office, which is located in downtown Clearwater. And as Neil already said, we offer a wide variety of services to businesses. We help out a lot of small business owners and sole proprietors, as well as some larger businesses. And we take great pride in being able to customize the needs for each one of our business owners so that we can help them get through things like hiring and firing without the need to go through stress or legal actions.
Yes, and it's a very big thing to have in place. And there's some very simple things that you can do to obviously protect yourself from a lawsuit or something like that, but also just to make sure that you don't open yourself up to doing something incorrectly and then find out you have a fine because you didn't do something properly, or things of that nature. And dealing with business owners and entrepreneurs, particularly the smaller the business, the more by the seat of our pants we tend to do things.
Oh yeah.
So that's why I wanted to bring you in to talk about these things. So from your perspective as an attorney dealing with business owners and businesses, I guess, where would you like to start as far as some of the common omissions that we business owners have that are creating potential legal issues or problems when it comes to hiring, firing? Where do you want to get started with on that?
Yeah, well, I think specifically when it comes to hiring and firing, and I'll start with hiring, of course, there's some basics that might seem to be intuitive, but they're not always. And, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I think all of us know that when we go into business for ourselves, and whether we are a one-man show or one-woman show, or whether we're planning on growing our business to have several thousand employees, we all kind of have an idea in our mind of the culture we want, what we want our business to represent and how we want people to recognize us, and just kind of the sort of environment that we want to create. But it's funny, it's often left out when we start sending out ads to hire people or looking to hire people, and this can start with the very first employee. We often don't give enough attention to those sorts of values or the type of environment that we want to create with the individual worker. And what I mean by that specifically is every job that you might fill, starting with the first job, there's going to be a certain type of person or a certain temperament that you would want filling that job. So it's really worth it to sit down and take the time to not only fill out what you would think the job duties are, like a job description, right? Qualifications, what do they need to be able to do? What's completely required? What's going to be asked of them sometimes? What are your make and break points for a certain position? I can't stress how important it is to sit down, take your time to write down those things, and also look at, hey, this is going to be the person, the face of our company when somebody walks in. This is the receptionist that we're hiring. What type of a person do we want in this position? What type of a temperament do we want this person to have? A lot of times people go into that initial interview completely unaware of exactly what it is. It's like one of those I'll know it when I'll see it type
Yeah.
of things. And really, that's probably the very initial step that gets left out way too often, that down the road you end up, going through 5, 6, 7, 8 people before you find that right fit, when you could have already tailored the particular job description, and also maybe some of the particular questions you would be asking in an initial interview. If you would have just spent maybe a half an hour talking to your staff, or even just asking yourself, if you're a solo business owner, important questions about the type of person you want in the position and what you want that position's duties to be.
Right. So by figuring out what you're looking for and having that duties and all that figured out, that means that you're going into it with an idea of what type of person you want to hire, but then B, you're spending less time hiring and then realizing you've got the wrong person and then having to fire and rehire and all that stuff, which I would imagine that would then protect you from a legal perspective of saying, well, yes, I did fire this employee because this is what I hired them to do. And this was the agreement. And then they didn't do that, or look, they couldn't do that, or et cetera, et cetera. It's protecting you in that way as well. Is that what I'm getting from that?
100%. If you have a job description that's very clear, easy to understand, you have the employee as part of his initial hiring paperwork read this job description, affirm that he or she, the person affirms that they actually can do these things, either with or without some aid or accommodation. And then at the very end, they sign it saying, yes, I can do this. And you have in there their essential job functions. Well, if they're not performing those essential job functions, and maybe you give them a verbal warning, maybe they have a few other written warnings, but if they're not doing those functions, and you have that in place, and you have it written that they signed and said they could do it, then yeah, it makes it a lot easier when it comes time to terminate somebody, because it's clear that what they were being hired for, they're not actually performing those duties.
Excellent. Okay. And so then this, from a duties perspective, this really does tie in very well to what we preach and what we work with MetaPulse as far as tracking statistics and things that your employees are doing. Is you have a job description and you said this is what you're required to do, and then you can look at the statistics, or you can look at what it is that they're supposed to do in MetaPulse and show from a legal perspective, like this is what they were doing, this is what they're supposed to be doing. So that actually can help somebody from a legal perspective as well, correct?
100%. And I think that measuring production based on statistics is probably the best way. It has to be the best way in order to actually be able to see if these essential job functions are being met, because essentially those are the items that would have your product, what the person is producing, whatever it is. And if you can't show in a statistic that they actually are producing, then they very evidently aren't performing their essential job functions and duties.
Okay. And so most people who come to you when they have an employee dispute, or they're afraid of firing somebody because there might be a lawsuit, would you say having that job description, having that agreed upon between them, is that like the most basic thing that you see is not being done as far as?
Yeah, so there's two. That's definitely one of them.
Okay.
And the second one I kind of touched on in the question before, but the other basic that's out, the very basic, is the job description. But then the next is when people are violating that job description, or they're not performing up to par. Too often there's lots of maybe verbal reports and talks, and a lot of people saying what the person is doing and isn't doing, but there isn't a lot of documentation in the personnel file showing, this employee was spoken to on such and such day about whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't handle it. Then it escalates to maybe a written warning that the employee actually reads. They have a chance to rebut it if they want, but then they sign it, so they read it. Documentation is key in avoiding disputes, and I really can't stress that enough. And it doesn't need to be some lawyerly, 30-page document. I'm talking about typing up a paragraph that you put in a personnel file every time you talk to somebody, because more often than not, I have employers come to me saying they want to fire someone. And when I say, okay, great, so let's go over the personnel file and see all the infractions, they don't have anything documented. There may have been talks, there may have been times where the employee was called in and maybe even given corrections to fix or things to read or additional training, but it goes undocumented. And, this is such an easy step. It really should only take, 10 to 30 minutes, probably closer to 10 minutes, depending on what the actual document is that you're writing up. Like I said, a verbal warning, we're talking about a few sentences that you type up and put in a file. And unfortunately, when you don't have that, it's way easier for an employee to try to make a case for discrimination or wrongful termination. Whereas if you have all those documents that would have just created minutes or would have just taken minutes to create, then you're really covering yourself and protecting yourself from legal dispute.
And I'd say that's very applicable when you have somebody that you're afraid of. I recently spoke to a business owner. Well, it wasn't the owner. I spoke to, let's say, the office manager of a business who, makes all the personnel decisions and manages all this stuff. And one of the things I ask a struggling business or a business that is having implementation issues, like we have this idea, but then the staff aren't doing it. Okay, well, who on the staff doesn't want to do it? Those are like the types of like, who's stopping it? And she said, yeah, we have this person and they've been there for 20 years and they just want to do everything their way and yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, well, maybe it wasn't 20 years, but it was a while that this person just, no matter what the owner of the business wanted to do, they're just going to keep doing it the way they've always done it. And like, I've been here longer than anybody. And she said, yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to offer her to reduce her hours. So instead of 4 days a week, 2 days a week. And I'm like, well, why don't you just get rid of the person? It's like, well, we're hoping that by reducing her hours, she just quits. Right. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, that is not the right way to go about firing somebody, is just hoping that they go away and don't create a problem. But if we had the policies like you talked about, like the job descriptions, the agreements, we had the medical statistics that show what's going on, what isn't going on, and then documentation of had a conversation with Suzanne, told her that we have to start doing it X, Y, and Z. Then a week later, Suzanne still isn't doing it X, Y, and Z, had another conversation, told, if you have that, then really you're minimizing the amount of risk that you have, because if you get a lawsuit filed on you and you have nothing, no matter how outlandish the person's claims are, it probably doesn't look good for the business owner.
No, I mean, it turns into a he said, she said, right? So it's when you have the party who has the documentation, even if it's, a handwritten note, that's going to be weighted more than somebody who's just recollecting, right, what occurred a year ago or 6 months ago or 3 months ago. So if you're just making notes in real time and putting it in a file, even if they're not fancy, even if they're handwritten, that's going to go a long way in showing that you were making the effort to actually document what was going on, and you were actually trying to rectify the situation. And by doing so, then you should be able to avoid, some type of legal liability that you may face when you don't have that documentation, or it's just you standing there saying, well, I think I remember we did this. I mean, people forget all the time. So you could say, oh gosh, I must have met with her and corrected her a bunch of times. The first thing that's going to come up is, okay, well, why isn't it documented? Why isn't it in the file?
So a personnel file for each staff member or employee with that type of documentation is pretty much a must.
Oh yeah.
Even if it's me who has a business with one employee.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you start with the one employee, and it's much better to get these practices in from the very beginning, writing job descriptions, keeping documentation, because if you don't, it's a lot harder to get them in when you have 50 employees, which unfortunately I see that a lot. I see people who the first, a lot of times the first 3, 4, maybe even 10 employees we hire are close friends, family members, people who we really trust. So we're not really worried about lawsuits, right? And it's great because it frees up our time to not have to do this documentation. But trust me, it's a lot harder training yourself and your staff to try to get things like this in, right? When you have 50 employees, 20 employees versus when you had 1 or 2. especially when the things that we're talking about, you don't have to pay a fancy lawyer to do. Most of them can just be done on your own. And it's worth starting it right from the beginning so that you don't make mistakes later on, or you don't get overwhelmed when you have 20 employees and you haven't done this from the beginning.
Yeah, if you can't do it with one employee, don't add more employees in until you can actually start documenting it properly and figuring these things out. That would be my best guess there.
100%, for sure, for sure.
Now, related to that, as far as the hiring process, as far as a couple of basics, we've got the personnel file where we actually put all this information, and we've got the job description and expectations and all that kind of stuff. Was there anything else as far as a simplistic, easy, or commonly non-done or a half-done type thing like that you wanted to mention before I get into the firing process?
Yeah, so one of the other most common outnesses that I see, and this is probably one of the most initial, is improper questions on a job application.
Yeah, this is a very tough one too, because it seems to change all the time. And it seems like really all you can ask somebody is their name, and that's about it these days, which even sometimes you can't even ask them that. I mean, every state is crazy. You can ask for references, but you can't call the reference, or the reference is only allowed to say good things. So it's like, why even have a reference? It gets pretty crazy.
It can. Yeah, it definitely can. The key to remember on job applications, especially if you are going to be calling references or doing background checks or doing credit checks, checking somebody's credit history, you always, always, always want to get informed consent, which means you want to have something in writing informing the person that you're going to be doing a background check on them. This is what you're checking for, or you're going to be doing a drug test. This is why, or you're going to be doing a credit check, right? Or a criminal history check, whatever it is. You want to let them know in advance in writing that you're doing this, and you get them to sign off on it. And that little document also can have a paragraph in it that limits your liability, right? Depending on what comes up as a result of the check, and if it's something that your establishment finds out, or if you are sending them to do a drug test, for example, you can make it so that the lab and you aren't liable. Things like this are super important, and really important, like you said, when we're talking about something like applications or questions that you might have on an application, when these things do tend to change year to year, and it definitely matters what state you're in, for sure. But I think there's a couple basics that are pretty simple to avoid, that are almost always you're not going to want to ask, because a lot of them do go to the heart of discrimination. One is the person's birth date, right? Because there's lots of cases out there for age discrimination. You don't want to have a birth date on somebody's application. You don't need to have that information in order to decide if you're going to interview them or not for the job.
So obviously I'm going to find out what their birth date is when I go to do a background check or something like that. But you're saying I send in an application that says, hey, I'd be interested. I, as a business owner, I say, hey, I'm looking for applicants. People send in an application. I notice that the birth date is missing. Haven't met the person, haven't talked to the person. I'm not going to write back and go, hey, what year were you born? That's what you're saying. Like, after you meet somebody and you're going to actually explore that or do a background check, obviously you're going to do that. But from an initial contact, no, probably a safe rule to say no birthdays.
Yeah, definitely safe, no birthdays. And then obviously if they're not the right fit for the job, down the road, when you find out when their birthday is, it's fine to not hire them if they're not the right fit. But you never want to be in a situation where the reason they're not being hired is their age, or could be their age, because obviously that's when we get into discrimination.
Yeah.
So that's the main reason to leave that question. Same with, you don't ask what religion somebody is on a job application, right? Yep. You don't need to know their religion and to know if they can or can't perform the job. Yep. A lot of times people will say stay away from marital status. You don't need to know if they're married or not. And then another big one that's come up recently is criminal history, especially with regard to felonies. Now, we did talk about background checks, and of course, when you run one, things like that might come up, and there's ways to deal with it, especially if you're hiring someone, say, to do your finances, and you find out they were convicted of felony embezzlement. Well, obviously that is a conviction that would go straight to the heart of the job that they're being hired for, and nobody would put you in a position where you would have to hire them for that. But there's often times where maybe somebody got arrested when they were 18 for disorderly conduct, or some maybe a misdemeanor or something like that really doesn't have anything to do with the job description that they're applying for 20 years down the road. And so that question is meant to avoid people just dismissing people or looking them over right away just because maybe something like that did happen in their past. And then that shouldn't necessarily in all cases make them ineligible for the job that they're applying for.
Right. Okay. So then this is also where I could see the job descriptions and the duties and all that we talked about also protect you in the event of if you decided not to hire somebody and they said, hey, I was discriminated against, and there's an investigation. You can say, well, actually, this job requires, security and biking 50 miles a day. And this person came in and they said they are overweight and they don't want to bike and they don't want to do security. So I didn't hire them. Like, it's kind of a way of saying, well, this was the description. They didn't want to sign it. They didn't fit these parameters. So that's a way of protecting yourself by not hiring somebody, I would assume. Is that correct?
100%. 100%. Yeah. Like you're hiring somebody to do transportation and deliveries, but you run their DMV record and they have a million speeding tickets and running stop signs, then obviously they're not going to be qualified for that particular job.
Okay. So that helps us in both those categories as well. For anybody just joining, we have Ashley Guernaccini here. She is an attorney with At Cause Law, and we're talking about legal hiring, legal basics for hiring, firing staff, etc. So if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the comments below. Okay, what else from a firing perspective do I need to know as a small business owner? Because like I said, it's us small business owners who don't have a legal person in-house or don't have a legal representative out-house, and it's 3-4 people, and we just sort of fly by the seat of our pants every day. What's another common thing that will help me when it comes to letting a staff member go that keeps me protected?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of really early on, even when you have that first employee, of establishing a written termination policy that includes a progressive disciplinary structure, similar to what we were talking about before with documentation in the personnel file. You have some kind of a system where an employee misconduct, the first offense, it's a verbal warning, right? Then followed by a written warning, which could potentially graduate into a sterner written warning with corrective actions included in it. Maybe following that is suspension. And then, of course, when we get to the point where we've exhausted a lot of our disciplinary efforts, then it's beyond a doubt cause for termination. And that's not to say that you can't also include in that policy that certain infractions, if they're severe enough, like stealing company property or assaulting another employee or things like this, could be grounds for immediate termination, of course. But when we're talking about maybe just small errors, or maybe even just interpersonal relationship type stuff, somebody who's maybe not the best with customers and you're just trying to work with them, they're not making huge problems with their job, or they're not committing huge errors. Maybe somebody like that, you would have them on a much lower gradient, and you would use lots of different disciplinary measures, especially if they are actually performing their job, until you got to the point of termination. Versus, like I said, somebody who steals company property or destroys a computer or causes a huge disruption. Well, something like that, obviously your termination policy would allow you to dismiss someone like that right away without having to give them any kind of warning.
Okay. So having that all figured out beforehand makes the process a lot smoother, obviously. And going back to that example I had of somebody who's like afraid to fire an employee because they're afraid of them being loud and noisy and creating problems. So if I do have somebody I identify as like a trouble, as I say, a 1-star staff member, right? So we have a 1-star staff member out of 5 stars. We have this 1-star staff member that we have to figure out what to do. And we know that maybe there was mistakes, maybe there wasn't, whatever. We're just afraid of saying, hey, it's time for you to go. And then, because this is honestly a big reason I find business owners keep people around, is they don't want to have to fire them, but then B, they're afraid of the fallout. And so we end up keeping people around for sometimes years that we don't actually want around just because we're afraid of the fallout. So let's say I have this person and I'm afraid of this fallout, but they have to go. What can I do if I've done, no documentation and we haven't done these other things that would protect us? How do I start to protect myself, I guess?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's always best to document, like I said, in real time. That's when it's fresh in your mind and it's going to
Yeah.
be given more weight because you're documenting it as it's occurring. However, that being said, I've been in this situation before when somebody's called me and they did have a lot that this employee was corrected on, but they didn't have it documented. So what I had them do was write up everything right then and there, right? Everything that they actually remember that they knew happened. And luckily for them, and obviously this could be different with a company where there's just one owner and one employee, but this particular company had a habit of always having either an HR manager or the person supervisor in with them when there was a correction being done. So that's another good, if you can do that, if you have
Right.
enough staff, especially when you're terminating somebody, you always want somebody else in the room with you. That way you have a witness to what's going on. And that can also be helpful as well when you're going over correction with somebody. If you at least have the employee and their supervisor in the room together, that way you have that extra person who, if it ever came down to it, could testify what actually happened. And that kind of helps combat that he said, she said issue that we were talking about earlier. But mainly I tell the person, say they don't have that luxury, it is just one employee, then I always have them at least document what did happen, right? And they would note that they're documenting it now, but they would go back and they would really write everything down in sequential order,
Yeah.
not including any additional information, just kind of like a timeline. Even that in and of itself is going to be more helpful than not having anything. And then the other thing, most importantly, and I have seen this happen over and over again, where people they almost get, scared or cowed of the employee, and they're worried about awful things that can happen to their business if they fire somebody.
Yeah.
But I like to stress that way more often than not, I see the opposite happen, where somebody keeps around an employee who is just very bad for the group, bringing other people down, or is just bad for production.
Yeah.
And that causes way more devastation. And I see way more companies kind of going down or losing revenue for that reason, right?
Yeah.
Rather than letting somebody go. And the way I look at it, this is another basic that we didn't talk about because it's not necessarily having just to do with hiring or firing, but that's what insurance is for in a lot of cases. You get ample insurance coverage so that if you get a frivolous claim or some kind of a claim filed against you, you have protection.
Yeah.
You have a way that your business isn't going to go under because of this claim.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point on that. Plus, I mean, sometimes we just get so focused on the business and the problems, and we think, oh, I'll deal with that employee later, and then you realize it's been a year and you still haven't done anything about it. And you don't know what to do about it, and then they stick around, and the business just keeps getting worse.
Yeah.
And you're right. I've seen so many times where just by firing one person in a business, it doubles, like just everybody's like, oh, thank God you fired her because I hated her, or like, man, that guy was terrible. If you weren't gonna fire him, I was gonna quit. I mean,
Right.
people like that do that all the time, and it's an important thing. If you have somebody that you don't like being around, then your customers and your other employees don't like being around them either. And just because you are afraid of some fallout of firing them, that's not an excuse to not fire them.
100%. You'll end up losing way more good employees, keeping one bad employee around, and it's not worth it. And also, I think a lot of employers have the false impression that they have to give long-winded explanations about why they're letting somebody go.
Yeah.
And not only is that not true, I often recommend that you do just the opposite. You want to maintain professionalism. And oftentimes it really 9 times out of 10 comes down to the fact that this person is just not a good fit for the company and the company's atmosphere. And it really, I mean, obviously if you have a file full of complaints or a bunch of reprimands, well, then it goes without saying. But
Right.
9 times out of 10, it really does just come down to the fact that for whatever reason, it's just not the right fit. And as long as you don't have an employee agreement in place that says you have to fire for cause, which is why I'm a big fan of the offer letter, and you blast all through it in bold that it's at will employment. So unless you have some kind of an agreement that states you have to fire for cause, then you really have to remember that you can let the person go at any time and they can decide to leave at any time. And really the termination meeting can be short, should be short. You can answer their questions. You want to be professional. You don't want to be abusive or outrageous with your speech, but it really can be kept very brief, and you don't need to get into all the whys. Lots of times, the more you talk and the more information you end up giving, that's what can come back to harm you, because that's what they're going to stick to. An employee can potentially stick to and try to say that there was discrimination, or wait, would you say there? Try to catch you on your words. So it's always best to not do that.
So it really is just one of those things. Hey, it's not working out. We're going to have to let you go.
Yeah.
And just kind of move on from there. If they ask questions, just, it's just not really working, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of keep it at that, I would assume.
Yeah. Thank them for the time that they put in with the company, and you appreciate it. But just like you said, it's just not working out, and you wish them all the luck.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we are getting, I know you have another appointment coming up here. So I'll ask you one last question, but before I do, this is Ashley Guernaccini with At Cause Law. You can find out more about her. They actually have a YouTube channel, At Cause Law, so you can go and check her out on YouTube as well. But we will probably, I'm sure, be doing some more like this in the future, since we're a half hour in. We didn't even make it to the training aspect of what we might talk about.
I know.
But when it comes back to what we've talked about so far before we wrap up, is there any other piece of advice or thing that you'd like to say to end off on to everybody that is watching that we might not have hit or talked about already?
I think the number one thing, and we brought this up right at the beginning, and I think it's probably the most important thing. And if you do this, it's gonna save you so much time and so much stress down the road, is to really take the time to sit down with the other owners of your business, or like I said, if you don't have other owners, if it's just you, to really sit down early on and brainstorm and really think about the type of image you want your business to portray to other people, and what you want to be known for, and the type of employees who you really want working for you. Really kind of thinking early on, or in your mind, getting into the mindset of what you desire for each position and each employee. And really starting to document that, and getting a clear path, so you're thinking with it every time you interview, any applicant you meet. That's just such a fundamental that, a lot of times when we're super busy in the day to day, it's just like, I need help. Who can help me? And
a warm body.
Can you do that? And I get it. And it can be very stressful when you are just running the show all by yourself. But I really can't stress enough how much time that will save you down the road if you really just scribble some policies down, like, what kind of values does your business have? What do you want your employees to do? What are the top 3 positions you're hiring for? And what do you want those positions to do by way of the essential job functions and with their qualifications? Taking an hour even to do this is just going to save you hours and hours down the road and lots of stress.
Yeah. And I would say from the business development side on that, decide who it is that you want to hire, and hire that type of person. And if you see people coming in that don't fit that, don't waste your time and hire them when you know that's not what you're looking for. That would be my word of advice on that too. It's not a
no, I'm glad you said that. That's a really good point. Yeah,
I'm not an attorney. I'm not an attorney, but it will save you from some lawsuits if you just
Oh
stick to the
yeah.
people that you want to work with, right?
Yeah, don't try to make it fit just because you really need the help, like go, it's funny. This is like definitely obviously not legal advice, but I think there's something to be said with like gut instinct or intuition. And if you're sitting across from the person and they're not the right fit, chances are they're not the right fit. Don't try it out,
Yeah.
just be a little bit patient. If you did your work in advance and you really did decide what you wanted in advance and you know what you're looking for, you're going to find it.
Yeah, stick with that, and that will work you off much better
Yeah.
as far as what you're looking for. So, Ashley, thanks again for coming on. I don't want to keep you from your next appointment. I know you and I could probably talk for another half an hour quite easily. So, if you guys watching have follow-up questions that you would like to ask Ashley next time, just put them in the comments down below. You can find her on YouTube at Cause Law. And what's your website if people want to look you up?
At causelaw.com.
Very simple. I figured that's what it
Very
would be,
simple.
but at causelaw.com, you can find out more about Ashley there. Ashley, thank you very much for coming back onto the channel. I'm sure we'll do more soon. And to everybody watching, leave some comments down below and hit the thumbs up. And we can talk more with Ashley in the future about other things like training staff. That was going to be the next thing that we talk about. So go ahead, leave your comments down there, and we'll see Ashley next time. Thanks again, Ashley.
Bye. Thank you.